This week, as we're going through Hebrews, we're getting to the main point of the letter, that in Jesus, God is doing something new and amazing for people of faith. We've already been reminded that Jesus saves us from sin and death. We've been reminded that Jesus, who is our high priest, helps us when we need help through temptations, trials, or whatever else we may be facing. And next week, we'll hear about some of the cool things that happen in faith. But today we get to hear about this new thing that God did in Jesus. And it basically works kind of like this, if I'm going to simplify it down as much as possible. Jesus means that the presence of God is no longer living in a building, but living in us. And the writers of Hebrews, of course, takes about 3 chapters to explain this idea fully, and we'll use our reading for some of that, but it really begins in chapter 8. But before we even get there, let's talk some background. So back in ancient times, the way that people understood gods to work is they lived in a temple, and if you wanted to go visit the god, you went to the temple. And in the Jewish temple, for instance, there were 2 sections. There was a holy part of the temple, which would be roughly equivalent to this part of the church, where you could go, and God definitely lived there, but he didn't, but it was like that room that you have all the furniture covered up until you have company over, and you don't ever use it, it's just there. Or was I the only person that had a room like that? And you had everything. I always wanted to be in that room, but I never could. But anywho, so it's this like area that's like God's there, but he's not really like there. And you can go there. The average person can go into that part of the room, and it's okay. But then there's the holy part. Now, so if this is God's like living room that he never actually goes in, this part, this is where God hangs out. And only certain people could go into that part. It's kind of unfortunate that in the way that we as Christians continue to build our churches, we still have the part that everybody can go and the part that only certain people can go. And it's unfortunate. Like we get to put the railings up and I don't like it, but it kind of works. But you can see this. We still have this attitude. We still have some of the ritual about it, that there's part of our church that's special, and there's part of our church that's special but slightly less special, and then there's the other parts that, they're fine. What happens in the narthex, that's fine. But we have this attitude still, though. And it's the same kind of attitude that people had in the olden times, that there was like an outer courtyard of the God's temple, and then there was like an inner part where only certain people could go certain times, and then there was the extra special part that even fewer people could go even fewer times. And that's just how it worked. That's how it was understood. In the tabernacle, the thing that he's talking about here, there was the holy place tent and the most holy place tent, and God lived, because of the Ark of the Covenant, in that holy place. And you can see this happen a lot of times in scriptures where there's this understanding that where the Ark of the Covenant is, there God is. One of my very favorite Old Testament stories is when the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines. And they take the Ark of the Covenant, this is the box in which God lives, as far as everyone of the time was concerned. And they took it to the temple of their god, a guy named Dagon. And they set the Ark of the Covenant at Dagon's feet because the Philistines beat the Israelites, therefore, Dagon was better than God. That's another thing how it worked back then. But what happened was, the next morning, they all came to the temple to go see victorious Dagon, and it turned out that Dagon had fallen flat on his face, the statue of Dagon had, and was bowing down and worshiping the Ark of the Covenant. So they set Dagon back up and assumed there must have been an earthquake or something, and it just knocked him over, and it's fine. But the next day they went back and Dagon was again fallen face down, only his head and hands were on the doorposts and at the door, and really awkward scene. It's one of my favorite Old Testament stories, and I look for any opportunity to share it because not everyone knows it, and it's just kind of fun. But it shows this idea that God lived somewhere, and in order to see God, you had to go to where God was. And that's the old system. So the writer of Hebrews picks up in chapter 8. We have a high priest who sat down at the right side of the throne of the majesty in heaven. So the high priest that we have in Jesus isn't living somewhere here on earth that humans have built. He's not in a tabernacle. He's not in a temple. He's somewhere in heaven at the right side of the throne of God. And the old covenant that Moses made is now obsolete because God is now present to his people in a new way. You don't have to go to the temple anymore to meet God because God now lives in us. We are God's temple. By the Holy Spirit living in us, we don't have to go somewhere to meet God because God is already with us. We don't have to go to a Holy of Holies. We don't have to find a priest to go into the Holy of Holies for us because wherever we are, because of the Holy Spirit, God is. This building is a great place for us to gather together as people, but this building is not special because God lives here. God lives in us. So what does this mean? Whereas before, to meet God, you had to go somewhere, we don't have to go anywhere to meet God anymore. We don't have to go to a temple. We don't have to come to this building to find where God is, because God is with us all the time. It's the great thing about we always talk at the end of Matthew's gospel about the Great Commission, where Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it's really unfortunate that we stop there whenever we quote that, because the very next thing is, I will be with you always until the end of everything. It's the last thing that Jesus says in Matthew's gospel, so it's probably kind of important. That Jesus will be with us no matter where we go and what we do. So the difference between this part and this part is no longer a difference. Because God is no more here than he is there, because God is with me. And sure, we still treat this area with respect, but like Jesus was saying when talking about the Sabbath, that's not the point. The rituals and the things that we do are not the point because Jesus is always with us. The rituals can help us to acknowledge Jesus' presence. They can help us to see things and help us to worship God for who he is, but they don't bring us any closer to God by themselves. Because we don't need a priest, we don't need a temple. Jesus is always with us. And so we have the presence of God in our lives. At Jesus' death, there's a thing that happens that never gets explained when we read it. But the curtain of the temple is torn in two. And that's not just like a wall hanging or like some nice banner. It's the curtain that split the holy place from the super duper holy place. And at Jesus' death, that curtain went away because the division isn't there anymore. There's nothing that keeps us away from God anymore because he said he's going to send his Holy Spirit to be with us always. And it's that presence of God that Jesus is, him being with us no matter what we do, no matter what we're going through. That's how he helps us. And it's the evidence that he has saved us. We don't need to come to church to find closeness with God. We don't need to come to a special building or go through a special person to find closeness with God, because he has already reached out to us. Jesus, because of who he is, made it so that none of those extra things get in the way anymore. And if we find ourselves needing God, he is already there helping us. Because the presence of God is always with us and never, ever leaves us. Because there is nothing that can make God love us any less than he does. And so he is always there. And that's the key. He's always there giving us the help that we need. He's always there to remind us that he has saved us. And he's always there strengthening our faith so that in those times when we feel like he's not there, I think those are the times when he's with us the most. Because of Jesus, the presence of God lives inside of us. And we don't need a temple because we are his temple. And he will never, ever leave us alone.